Good morning, and thank you all for being here and showing your interest and participating in these important conversations. We're going to slightly shift the focus a little bit and talk about the systemic threats to the food systems that we are experiencing. And obviously, this is an integral part of the climate security conversation, albeit often in policy debates, food security is still seen as a humanitarian and aid issue. And I think there is a need to move the conversation forward into a more strategic, security-related environment where we really can come up with systemic solutions to what is tending to be a food system of two worlds, a food system that works mostly in the northern part of the globe and a food system that does not tend to work in the southern part of the world. And anyone who thinks that under these circumstances we will be living in a good world 20 years from now, I feel is greatly mistaken. So I would like to ask our panelists in the first round to give us a snapshot of what they think are the biggest systemic risks to food security in the specific areas that they're working on. I'm going to start with David Ismay at Grow Intelligence, who flew in from the United States this morning and is still awake. Thank you so much for that sacrifice. He is stepping in for Sarah Menka, who is his colleague at Grow Intelligence, traveling on an African passport, made unpleasant experiences with the Schengen visa rules. So David sacrificed himself and said, I'm going to stand in for my good colleague, Sarah Menka. Grow Intelligence is an interesting company that does AI-based simulations of shocks and disruptions in the global food systems and is advising a lot of large companies. I read that you're advising companies with assets under management of over $30 trillion. So we know who we have to blame in case these companies make decisions that are to all our detriment. So David, from your analytical perspective, give us a snapshot of what your 2 or 3 major concerns are when you're looking at the food systems area on a global scale.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And Grow Intelligence, as Michael said, we're a data and analytics company. Sarah started Grow to bring better data around agriculture and the global food system, having been an energy commodities trader for years, and she saw the value that more global information, particularly forward-looking, could bring to the market. And it was good to see Kate Roy here. We're a Prepare partner in that effort and pleased to be there. You know, what we're seeing more and more, and this may be stating the obvious, is that we really do have a global food system that is tied together, and so we're experiencing more and more shocks rippling across the globe, and where in certain areas it's still sufficient, but more and more having a global outlook on a certain crop for a trader or for a government or for business it's not enough to have a local or a regional view, but to have that global view. Some of the things, I mean, we lived through a real world experiment, unfortunately, and we're still feeling the effects with COVID and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine at a time when major grain-producing areas of the world were seeing simultaneous 10-year high droughts. And so we're seeing this layering on of pressures and shocks onto the food system. And then we're also seeing, as I'm sure many of you are, that the impacts and the effects of those shocks are falling unevenly across the globe. They're falling particularly heavily on net food importing countries, many of which are in the Middle East and Africa. And as we saw in 2022, food prices increased in Europe and in the US, but not with the same socioeconomic impact as in other parts of the world. And there's also we're seeing this sort of hysteresis, this lag through time that again falls unevenly. Right now we've been looking a lot at the effect of local currency valuations on this food security problem. Again, particularly important for net importing countries. Right now, we're still seeing relatively, actually very high food inflation in Egypt. The prices for wheat there are still much higher than they are other places in the world, mainly because of a currency and debt issue. So I won't go too much further. I mean, I think what we're really seeing, the data shows that these systems are tied together. I think, one of the benefits of that, so obviously a lot of risk there, but platforms like the one we are building help to bring visibility to that, and we can get ahead of it. So we do, as Michael said, a lot of simulation. We do shock simulation, and as well as just leading indicators that can give governments and businesses 1, 2, 3 months lead time on a building crisis, and that is not a lot of time, but it's enough time to act proactively. And I think we had a good policy story coming out of the shocks to the Black Sea grain markets. We had run some simulations that would show what that would have looked like in the absence of the incredible, almost heroic effort, by the US and the EU and the world community to step in. So that's a warning sign, or a canary in the coal mine, or a real world experiment that we lived through, but there's also, I think, a valuable policy demonstration of policy working there.
Thank you very much. And obviously, needless to say, impacts on wheat markets, especially for countries like Egypt, where 30 to 40% of the caloric daily input of people is by bread, are devastating and have political massive impact.
Absolutely.
Let me move over, staying in Africa, to Dhesigen Naidoo, who joins us from Pretoria. He's the head of program at the Institute for the Studies of Security. He's also working on water resource management and is a World Bank advisor. Give us your snapshot on what you see as the largest challenges in the food security arena in your specific line of work, Dhesigen.
Certainly, thank you for that. First, we're going to have difficulty keeping up the optimism coefficient of the last two panels. I think we're getting into the reality bites of where we are. Look, for Africa as a whole, this is a multi-dimensional challenge and extraordinarily serious. I mean, the first issue is that food insecurity is a genuine problem in our part of the world, and more than that, the sustainability of whatever food security there currently is, it's at high risk. The issues that make the media more often than not are the extreme weather events, and of course they're very significant, and we think it's incredibly unfair that the continent that contributes less than 4% of greenhouse gases in the world is probably most vulnerable currently to the impacts of climate change. But the other parts of that is, in addition to the existing food insecurity, and there's both an element of acute and non-acute, there's the issue of the intergenerational debt that we are creating with the stunting of the under fives, which means we have a long-term problem to deal with. If that isn't enough, what this is doing, because agriculture as an enterprise occupies a very large number of people in Africa, we are seeing the acceleration of climate-driven migration across the continent, which creates a whole new dimension of problems and challenges for peace and security. And then we go to another level of that, and the other level of that is that Africa continues to have export ambitions. So when the rest of the world is moving at a particular pace around its own decarbonization transition, that actually presents very serious threats to African food systems, because now there's going to be a restriction of markets on the back of the likes of CBAMs, for example. So it is a very intricate and reinforcing vortex that represents the challenge inside the system. There are, of course, very useful ways out of it, but those useful ways out of it require the kind of international collaboration we've been talking about earlier today. You know, one of the issues that was emphasized at the African Climate Summit is how true to form the food security issue was in illustrating the threat multiplier component that was pronounced by the AU Peace and Security Council around the climate development and security nexus. So there is a regional challenge. It is felt and expressed nationally and at the most local level in most of Africa.
Thank you very much. And we will have a second round where we talk about policy implications and what needs to be done about this. But I think your point is well taken, that there's an asynchronicity between how people move towards carbon neutral economies and policies, and that there are different impacts in different parts of the world that need to be part of the bigger picture. I think that's a very important point. Let me move on to Grazia Pacillo, who is working for CIGAR and is one of their climate security leads with a particular focus on Latin America, more specifically Central America. Grazia, same question to you that I asked Dhesigen. How does the food security world look from your perspective?
Thanks a lot, and thanks for this great panel to our fellow panelists. Just want to say I'm not standing like this because I want to be upfront, just because, you know, being a short woman, I think this is very comfortable chairs, but not very good for short legs, so apologies. But yes, absolutely. I really would like to move us from this macro perspective, very great insights for my fellow panelists, to the micro perspective of what really happens in the ground. CGIAR, I don't know if you know about us, is a consortium of research institutes, and we really work on transforming land, water, and food systems in the climate crisis. And our team specifically focuses on climate security. So we've been working in the past 4 or 5 years to collect evidence on how the food systems can be transformed, should be transformed as a consequence of the impact of climate, conflict, and other compound risks on land and water systems. And the evidence that we have collated across more than 15 countries using different types of methodologies, quantitative methodologies, but also highly participatory methodologies, really tells us that it talks to the centrality of the food systems, land and water systems, and their role in this compound risk area that we live in, and their strong role as mediators of the climate security nexus. What that means in practice, that we have strong evidence from many countries, is that when something happens in the food systems, on food security, nutrition insecurities of households in the ground, in the climate security hotspots, we have direct consequences on security, human security, conflict, and tensions. But the pathways that explain this relationship, of course, they cannot be generalized, they should not be generalized, because climate security hotspots are inherently very different. It should be considered different, but the impact that climate change has on land, water, and food system goes across multiple contexts, and the centrality of food security is there. We see forced displaced people, we see more an increase of structural inequalities, and this can lead to several consequences in not only the rural areas, but peri-urban and urban settings. And specifically, when we talk about climate security, often we forget about other continents. We tend to focus on Africa, but something similar, very, very striking, is also happening in other contexts, such as, for instance, the Central America dry corridor, where 40 to 50% of the total population lives in acute and severe food and nutrition insecurity, so about 14 million people, I think. But the narrative there is radically different, because here, compared to the Africa settings, where the traditional farmers-herder conflict type of relationship and implications on food security on that is particularly strong. Here we focus in the Central American dry corridor on issues such as high inequalities, structural inequalities. We see power dynamics that are entirely different. So they look, for instance, at the conflict tensions between large and small-scale farmers, or between farmers and other natural resources demanding activities, such as the hydropower generation, or the tourism, or the mining activities, etc. But also, this is a case study where we see different sources of conflict that are not necessarily related to farmers-herder conflicts, or between farmers, or between pastoral communities, but it is the role of criminality and the gang activities is the primary, the opportunity opportunity cost of joining these groups is what makes really, is its main source of insecurity in these. And we see, just to conclude, I know that we need to stick to the time, we see that food security really plays a strong role, and this is via the worsening of the livelihoods, via the forced displacement and migration, but via also the increasing difficulties and unequal access structurally across multiple levels of access and availability of resources, specifically water resources. We see conflict between farmers, we see conflict between different communities, but even between countries as the river basins that cut across different countries. So we really need to think when we look at solutions, and I hope that we have the space to discuss that, on how do we transform the land, water, and food systems, but to make it, I heard it from previous discussions, to make these also an instrument for peace. So really leveraging the peace potential of these systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grazia. And obviously, it's needless to mention that the pressures, the migratory pressures that are created by that dry belt in Central America and the Northern Triangle, as we would say in the United States, towards Mexico and the United States, will be a prominent feature of next year's presidential election, as much as it was a feature of many European elections post-2015. So there are secondary effects that might politically be even more cumbersome to deal with and more difficult to address than the immediate challenge on the ground. So I think this is an important dimension that you just described. Susanne Fries-Geyer is the Director of Humanitarian Assistance here at the Foreign Office. Thank you again for hosting all of us here in Berlin in this beautiful room. Susanne, you are mostly dealing with the humanitarian and also the conflict and peace nexus. From what you have heard on the panel so far, give us a few examples of how the ripple effects of food insecurity or food-driven instability, how they translate into the work that you do every single day.
Thank you very much. So maybe let's start with the facts first. We have 258 million people in 58 countries which are acutely food insecure. That shows us that we are far away from our goal to reach, which we gave us with SDG 1 and 2, to end hunger in the world, right? So this has many reasons, and they were mentioned before. So of course we're here, climate change, yes, for once, but prolonged crisis, huge displacement, but as well the ripple effects of the COVID pandemic with the delivery chains broken, but you said it as well, the massive repercussions of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And you can feel the global effects, but you can see it in all the fragile countries I travel to. So before the panel that mentioned Sahel, I was there. So even if the people had enough money to buy seeds and grow something, after so many failed rainy seasons, it's just not possible anymore. And of course, and it was mentioned as well, it has effects that on the security. So the fight on resources. So it is a question of security, it's a question of peace, and we will never get resilient, sustainable agricultural and food systems if we do not think cross-sectional. And this is why we, and this is what my department does, look at our toolbox at hand and come up with new and innovative solutions. And it was mentioned at the first panel as well, cooperation and listening to those who are on the ground, so local solutions. This is the way to go, but I guess we will come to this in the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's kind of move exactly into the direction that you just spelled out, Susanne. Dhesigen, let me start with you. You have unique Africa expertise that many of us lack, and obviously this is an important point of reference. There have been long-standing discussions about development of agriculture, food security, sustainable development goals in Africa itself, one prominently leading to the Malabo Declaration in 2014. By that standard, 80% of African countries currently do not make the targets that were established. 22 out of 36 are food insecure. So tremendous challenges. In a first step, and maybe also looking at African institutions, the role of the African Union and other institutions that you are familiar with, what in an ideal world would be the policies that we need to push for, let's say in the next 3, 4, 5 years, to begin addressing these issues in earnest?
Yes, certainly. Look, the challenge is immense, but I think we have to open our eyes to the opportunity that we currently have, and a collective understanding and a prioritization of these matters now across the board is definitely a plus, and we need to bank that. And it's a plus not only on the African continent with the African leadership, but with all the partners of Africa as well. And what this means is that we can take the things we've been talking about for the longest time and now have a very practical example to apply it. And here we're talking about all of the agendas around reform, and the institutional reform on the African continent is quite stark. Around engaging the issues of trade, so the food security issue and the broader food value chain issue has become a prominent part of the discussions on the setting up of the AFCFTA, the free trade agreement in Africa, which I think is really important. The DFIs that operate in our part of the world are now engaged, led interestingly by the IFC, around what these new innovative mechanisms can mean for financing agriculture, not only to ensure that we get past the issue of food security, but to actually organize for Africa to be a genuine global bread basket. I mean, Africa importing food has to be an irony. Yes. And then the last thing I want to put into that pot for us to think about is that we really need genuine and expanded global partnerships around this. So Africa is looking quite seriously at two things around that in particular. One is, what does the partnership concept mean in our own development plan? And we're already talking about Agenda 2063 2.0, because Agenda 2063 as it stands is neither climate resilient nor sufficiently detailed about the partnerships that are required. And secondly, to cotton on to what the Kenyan ambassador has spoken about, is that while we have this architecture that we are vying for, begin now with the willing partners, if you like, around developing those coalitions to make this move in a positive direction. The alternative to doing this is too stark and too dangerous to contemplate.
Let me follow this up briefly, just out of curiosity. I think there's a growing understanding in Western countries, in Europe, in the United States, that there is legitimate disenchantment, especially in Africa, with how things have gone over the last 15, 20 years following the economic crisis in 08, 09, the COVID crisis, the tardiness in getting vaccines to the continent. That is all, I think, finally taken into account and digested. Since you have been hosting the new and expanded BRICS in your home country, do you feel, talking about global alliances, that an institution like BRICS will be an actor in the development, food security, and climate era, and an actor that will define interests within a broader scope as African interests that serve people on the ground, or will that be held back by national interests that are present within this fairly diverse, now that it's expanded, organization?
So that's the theme for the next conference. Look, the participating countries in Africa, and there are now 3 in Africa and some very close partners beyond. We have a lot of chips on that table, let's be plain. And with some of the things that have already begun, both with the original BRICS and now with the possibilities that exist around the BRICS plus 6, there is a way to do maybe 3 things. One is create a genuine plurilateral functional relationship around some of the issues, not all of the issues, but some of the issues. We're hoping that this will be sufficiently encouraging to other partners that Africa has in the world to create a different ecosystem within which we operate. And I think that is possible. I mean, there are the official lines around the attitudes to BRICS, and then there are the unofficial conversations that are very encouraging. The third thing that I think becomes really important inside this is that one has to understand that the BRICS plus partners themselves have different prioritization of BRICS in their own partnership ecosystems. And in the way this is spoken about, particularly in the media in my part of the world, it's kind of a binary, it's an all or nothing law, and it can never be. But I do think that there are some very interesting possibilities, one of which is related to the fact that these are players that have, if you like, a common interval of where they are in their own development trajectories and can therefore do many more things together as opposed to the traditional North-South relationships. But I should add that, you know, we're hoping that some of our northern partners will get just a little bit jealous and want to woo us with more enthusiasm.
Thank you very much for that frank assessment. Grazia, let me go back to you. Your organization runs a massive climate security dashboard. You try to provide scientific data and bridge the gap towards policy making. I'm not going to ask how is this going, but what do you think are the low-hanging fruits, if there are any, in the climate security food nexus, where we need to push for new policies, implementing and institutionalizing the discussions that we're having here on this panel?
Thanks a lot, Michael. And once again, I want to bring the conversation from the global discussion, really great discussions here on different topics, but to the ground, when we talk with the households, when we talk with farmers, when we talk with policymakers at local level. And yes, the Climate Security Observatory was essentially created to collate all of this evidence and to provide policymakers with the policy-relevant, timely evidence on where is this happening, how is this happening, for whom, and to provide also solutions somehow to make sure that we are able to transform the food system, land and water systems in light of the climate crisis, and also increase the potential to contribute to peace. Because ultimately, we cannot achieve our SDGs separately. It has to be a joint effort. We cannot have climate resilience without peace, and we cannot have peace without climate resilience. So we really have to think along these terms. But effectively, I mean, I'm really interested, and I was very, very happy to hear that there's a lot of very nice conversations in the places of power, you know, the New York, UN Security Council, here in other nice locations in the north of the world. But then whenever we go and we work across 80+ countries, and specifically on this climate security, many of these, when we go and talk with our counterpart policymakers, Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Environment, they are those that are implementing the potential solutions, then they are absolutely myopic vis-a-vis this nexus. We have the evidence, we said it many times, but this doesn't reach these places. Why is it not reaching? Or simply, I mean, the policymakers, they don't see the value for them to embrace this nexus, because of course they lack the mandate or they lack the interest in a way. So they don't see somehow the value for that. But Kenya is a good exception, actually. We've been working very closely with the policymakers in Kenya to really bring this nexus into the implementation of, for instance, the adaptation policy, etc. But essentially, I have three main words of things that we need to do to make sure that this nexus reaches that we bridge the science policy gap. And this is decolonization, and we talked about this yesterday also in our roundtable on inclusion. Decolonization, localization, demand-driven. We need to be more radical in a way that we've been doing research and also identifying solutions, in ensuring that funds for research also reach and are dedicated to Africa institutions, which currently receive only 3% of the funds, which is obviously not enough, clearly. But we need also to make sure that this science that is produced locally, that is demand-driven, reaches the places in the different governments. Another thing that I would like to say is that we need to be more strategic and more disruptive in the solutions. So empowering already those what we call disruptive seeds that are already trying to avert to change the power dynamics in certain contexts, and they try to change it from within, from the bottom, from the local communities, etc. And we need to ensure that we collaborate and empower to these disruptive seeds to really try and make change, to make climate adaptation and propose climate adaptation solutions as instrument for peace.
Thank you very much, Grazia. Since you brought up Kenya, and it seems Kenya is in the Champions League of the Nexus countries, give us a little bit of a flavor. If you talk to people, policymakers across 80 countries, where are you surprised that the conversation is more advanced than you might have thought? Where are you disappointed and think a lot more needs to be done? Give us a little bit of a snapshot of what your experiences are.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever we go and talk to countries or Minister of Agriculture and Environment about climate security, the first thing that they say, this is not in our mandate, we don't do security. And in some other countries, like we went recently in El Salvador, for instance, they said, well, there's no security issues, so we don't talk about it. Or in other countries, like Senegal, they say, well, again, we're very peaceful, we don't have an issue with climate security. So fundamentally, at local and national level, and I mean, our colleague Linda from ICFA knows this very well, fundamentally, we need to work on it. We need to work on the narrative that this is a climate, land, water system security nexus, and this is not about security. It is about making sure that we find solutions that align climate resilience and peace building objectives. So yes, absolutely, a lot of difference. There's a lot of work to do on that.
Great. We have very diplomatically circumvented the mentioning of any countries. I'll ask you again over lunch to do your most wanted lists on which 10 countries need to do more. Susanne, the German government has been very, very strongly engaged in a lot of multilateral organizations, most recently with the evolution roadmap of the World Bank that without US and German initiative probably would have never materialized. What other institutional changes and government initiatives are necessary? What is being done? And maybe more importantly, what needs to be done to accelerate a process that is obviously lagging behind the tremendous challenges that we're seeing?
Yeah, so first of all, food security in our so let me mention 3 points. Humanitarian assistance is the first one. Food security has always been a priority in our humanitarian assistance. But since the war on Ukraine started, we have accelerated this, and we have given an additional 5 billion euros. Yeah, it was 5 billion euros. And 1.7 alone for the World Food Program. I saw the colleague here. So we tried to really mitigate the effects that this war had on global food security. On the other hand, and this is globally, we try to be more preventive. So anticipate where a crisis will hit and give out humanitarian assistance beforehand. Usually it's very reactive, but we try to change this. It's a kind of a paradigm shift, and we invest a lot and we lobby. And we have a G7 agreement that we will all accelerate our budgets for this kind of anticipatory action. So, and this works very well with climate-induced crises, and you mentioned it, we have the data. And so if we have the data, we should act, and this is, again, as well, a nexus issue. The second point is peace and stabilization efforts. So at the beginning, Marcos Hicken mentioned that in Nigeria, for example, we have very good experiences in doing mediation work with farmers, with herders, over resource conflicts. However, there are a lot of questions still out there. So how to bring the government in? How can we link this to development cooperation? Where are the risks? And all these questions we try to tackle in a new innovative project. It's a kind of a flagship project called Weathering Risks. So we have some pilot projects and see how we really can include the question of climate security into our policy toolbox and getting better. And the third point, and I already mentioned it, is collaboration and breaking down the silos. And it's one, I think, very good initiative that we started last June we brought together in a conference which was organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Development Cooperation, and the Ministry of Agriculture. And this is very seldomly the case that we do something together. But we hosted an international conference, and we have now a global food alliance that came out of this conference. So this is one of the steps that we do. But as I said, and that's why I'm so glad that so many of you are here, experts from the countries, because we have to listen more. We have to listen what is really needed, and then come back and adapt eventually the programs that we have set up.
Thank you very much. Before I ask David to comment on what he has just heard from his analytic perspective, I would ask the people that have the microphones for our question and answer session step forward, and I would ask you in the audience to signal those that have microphones in their hands, and they are moving forward as I speak, that you would like to make an intervention so we don't lose too much time. So feel free. There are behind you in the back, and they are signaling that they will be willing to hand over the microphone. Let's make sure we don't lose too much time. David, you've been in the analytical perspective. You also, as somebody that formerly was a Navy SEAL and worked in the U.S. military, you know about hard security. What you have just heard, is that enough? Does it make sense? Where are there deficiencies that we need to push further? And then maybe, given your experience also as a public policy person in the state of Massachusetts, how do we convince an increasingly wary public that doesn't want to spend even more money on things that sometimes still might be abstract? How do we convince people that the climate, food, security nexus is real? This is not something that we just make up here on the stage, but it'll have tangible impact at the very, very foreseeable future. So with these easy questions, I give you 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that second one. But I really think, Susanna, you framed it beautifully. The thing that I'm seeing most from my experience in the military, my experience in the government, and now in the analytic space is we do have the data. We can develop solutions, we can be proactive, we can be somewhat predictive, we can certainly model, and I'm not here as a tech evangelist, there's lots of problems with modeling, but it allows decision makers to get views of potential futures and think through crises or think through, at choke points, at various impacts ahead of time, and sort of stress test our policies, stress test our reactions. And I think connecting what Susanna said with Michael, what you started with, that I think one of the most important things is a mindset shift. Right. So absolutely humanitarian aid has always been, a core value for Germany, for the EU, for the US. And I think it's that mindset shift which this conference demonstrates is happening, to seeing it as a national security, a physical security, where being proactive, like you said, taking that, and I mentioned, I think the terrible tragedy of that's ongoing in Ukraine, but the policy response demonstrates that it is possible to do that. Mm-hmm. So, from my time in the Navy, and there's lots of problems with war gaming and simulation, but having that shift of mindset is probably the #1 element. It's one of the reasons, again, that Sarah started Grow Intelligence, was looking at the world and not seeing the same tools that she had on Wall Street as an energy commodities trader around global food commodities, global food security. So it wasn't that it was impossible. I mean, I think we're doing a good job and doing some interesting things, but it was more of her mindset shift to create that. So just as an example of getting ahead of that, I think that's really what we need. Yeah, it sometimes feels as if we have to learn the 3-dimensional chess game, whereas we used to a 2-dimensional chess game in the past, because these are very, very complex layered issues. Let me turn it over to you. Is there anyone in the audience that already has a microphone or would like a microphone? If not, please, gentleman over here. And then there's a gentleman over here, if you could hand over this microphone. So, before you begin, ground rules. Let us know who you are. Question, not a statement. You can only choose one person on the panel, not ask all of them. I'm going to collect 3 questions. Sir, please.
Thank you so much. James Kur Morwell, an ambassador, Director of Consular Service within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of South Sudan. I'm currently the national focal point for the Khartoum process, but also former chair of the Khartoum process. I handed over to Germany last March. Khartoum process has the mandate of not only to identify root causes of migration, but to attempt to address those root causes. The root causes being two, man-made and natural root causes. I concur with the request of refraining from dwelling on the root causes, effects, and impacts of climate change, but concentrate instead on solutions. The moral obligation to clean up our environmental mess and to help the developing world to jointly transit into renewable energies. Our Mother Earth has abundantly provided and endowed us with enormous natural resources, enough to sustain her over 8 billion children to peacefully have a dignified life. This requires equitable, just, and responsible exploration, exploitation, development, and fair sharing of the revenues from these global natural resources. Example.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. We have very limited time. We appreciate what you just said about the Khartoum process. One question for one of the panelists, briefly, if I may, because there are others that would also like to speak.
Thank you so much. I just want to go straight to the situation in the Republic of South Sudan. When you talk of global warming, climate change, extreme weathers, flooding in our case, let me just bring to your attention, it has the largest wetlands in the world. The Nile, the White Nile Basin, and more than 30 other tributaries. It is when you have the access water, the flooding, that they burst their banks and cause flooding. 7 states out of 10 are underwater. Number 2, the Republic of South Sudan is known to be #1 in the world in the number of cattle per capita. So you can easily see the equation between loss of life, livelihoods, and so on.
Perfect.
We would like to benefit from the experience of Switzerland and Mali.
Okay. Thank you so much for your intervention. I think we are going to move to the next speaker. I appreciate you sharing this information with us. Sir, you are next, and then if you would like, if someone else would like to signal to the lady that has the microphone, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Simon Ilse from Heinrich Böll Foundation. I just have a quick question to Mr. Naidoo from ISS on, you mentioned the African-European Free Trade Agreement, and there's also this tool of the German policy of just energy transition partnerships. And I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on the food security nexus in these agreements, and what are challenges and problems, and what would you like to see more in these agreements. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm going to take 2 more. Sir, you please, and if there's anyone else, please indicate.
I'm the Bangladesh ambassador based in Netherlands. It's great to hear the references to seed food security, but I think we need to see food security and nutrition security together. And where we are finding it difficult in South Asia is that it's dominated smallholders. Smallholders are roughly 70%, if not in South Asia, but across. But how would we and can we, I'm looking at CG system as also you, and now in the days of data applications, bring in those to the small and marginal farmers, because they are at risk most. We're talking of Africa, but perhaps if you look at Asia as such, and those in the fringes, how would you look at them combining CG system as also the data applications together? And it's a question to both of them.
Thank you very much. One more, if there is interest, over here in the front, Janani.
Thank you, Janani Vivekananda from Adafi. I'd like to ask about about the political challenges around national sovereignty versus joint action. So as we see climate putting a stress on food security, I think this is a question for Ms. Fries-Geyer. Can you see any opportunities around some of the multilateral processes like the Global Food Alliance or maybe other levers to kind of circumvent some of the very real challenges around nationalist policies that will come into play, kind of export bans, hedging on food and commodities markets, this kind of thing?
Thank you very much. Let me start with Susanne, and then David and Grazia can focus on the very interesting questions with regard to the seed structures, and the last word will go to South Africa.
Thank you for the question. So first, maybe to differentiate. So if we talk about humanitarian assistance, as we know, according to the humanitarian principles, and governments hopefully always agree that we have access to wherever there is need for food. The other thing is stabilization. And you cannot do stabilization work without the governments. You have to bring them in. And the idea is to strengthen them and their policies and to help them improve it. And exactly as you said, bring their ideas and also the social programming to make it fit for purpose. And we're there to help, and where we do sometimes we test different ideas, and we have to do this together with them. If not, it will not be successful. And maybe I'll just add something to our colleague who talked about South Sudan, because our commissioner was just there in South Sudan, and it's sure it's massively affected by the flooding, and it's as well on our agenda, and it's one of our focus areas as well. But as well, she talked with the government of how the government can also come in with their social programs to mitigate some of the effects, so that it is not just the humanitarian actors who are there and helping to tackle the crisis.
Thank you very much. It's maybe an interesting footnote that with regard to Sudan, that Cindy McCain, who recently took over the World Food Program, on her first trip to the region in Sudan, actually invited the Director Generals of the FAO and of IFAD to join her. Somebody told me in Rome that this was the first time that the three DGs were traveling together in history. I was surprised by that, but maybe then again, not that much. So this really shows that there is a lot of cross-referencing going on even within multilateral institutions that needs to be emphasized in the future. Grazia.
Thanks a lot. But can I just quickly comment also on humanitarian?
You can quickly.
Sorry, because also referring to WFP and the different multilateral organizations, what we have seen, and this is coming from a research organization working primarily on development, is that there is going to be an increase, a substantial increase of attention and funding towards humanitarian, with a detriment for development. You know, WFP changing lives, saving lives, and similarly across all of the others. And of course, I mean, this doesn't say well in terms of humanitarian development peace nexus if we only focus on humanitarian. So just wanted to put the access on that, you know, we are aware that emergencies are increasing, but how do we stop the disconnect between humanitarian development? Yes, please.
Yes, please, briefly.
Very, very quickly. So we see that, and sometimes development actors are not on the ground because the security situation does not allow for it. So humanitarian actors are there, so they have to do sometimes the work of. So, but that is not ideal, I agree. However, and that's what I wanted to say, we have set up a new fund. It's a nexus fund in the Lake Chad region. So, and this should encourage all actors on the ground to design the project together, and only then they will receive the money. So let's see if this works, but it's a new idea on how we can do that.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot. So going back to the CG solutions and data, I say, I don't know, collaboration somehow? How do we leverage this? So on the solution space specifically, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, we certainly have to broaden our coverage. I mean, we work in Southeast Asia quite a lot, as you probably know, and but then bringing the lens of climate security is something that we are working on today. We've been working in the past year or so, because CGIAR has been working on land, water, and food systems, understanding the climate impacts on these systems. But this also stops short as well in understanding what happens next? So what are the implications for human security, food security, etc.? This is what we're trying to do even within our system. But it will be key for us to transform all the solutions that we have developed in the past 50, 60 years to make sure that these respond to the new security and the understanding lenses that we are using. So we are working on that. And as a part of this work in sort of the making climate adaptation and solutions an instrument for peace, then we are also working with local communities and local government to identify financial instruments to support, to implement this idea in the ground. So we don't really want to stop at the understanding and the framing, etc. We are trying to implement these solutions in the ground, but also at global level, directly with climate funds, the Green Climate Fund specifically. And the issue there is that all the climate action that has been done in the past, adaptation, etc., has never really been that conflict sensitive or peace responsive. So we are developing a mechanism whereby the tool to allow for this conflict sensitivity and peace responsiveness to increase it, to be mainstreamed across all of the different climate adaptation projects that the DGCF is going to implement. And this tool will be, dashboard will be launched at COP28, so we have very high expectations on that, and hopefully will also trigger down to the South Asia and etc.
Thank you, Grazia. Over to you, David.
Yeah, and certainly getting data to the people who need it is critical, and the role of smallholder farmers around the world is absolutely instrumental or absolutely critical to the solution. GROW operates really at a global market level, and I realize that a lot of the dashboards and data visibility platforms sort of look up. They look up to the global players, to policymakers. I think what we are seeing, though, is the potential for, and there's certainly a whole range of technology that is focused on farmers and farm-level solutions using remote sensors and lots of big data and AI. That isn't our space, but what we are seeing is some value. We've had some really interesting interactions where usually not below the city level for us, but getting questions from city officials around the world about the potential impact of events on local production in their area. And that's a question that we feel we can answer much better by having the global visibility, right? That we understand the multiple drought zones that are simultaneous, and certainly people in the climate or the weather space understand that. It's breaking down those silos and sharing that information or integrating it so that people who were used to looking at just sort of a regional picture and their own situation understand, particularly for commodity crops, the network they're in. So I see a lot of potential for reflecting that information down or getting a version of everybody doesn't have to understand the global picture themselves, but if they are getting a product that that does understand and integrates that global picture, it can bring that value. And then there's some really exciting things that we're seeing with the large language models and the generative AI. We use it in our space, generative AI, more on a scientific basis to fill in data that's missing from remote sensors and things like that. But the LLM version, we're exploring it as a data discovery tool that is very democratic. If we can take it, it's sort of takes some expertise to navigate GROW's system right now, I'll be honest. It's a data science platform, and so it brings a lot of value to people who know how to interrogate the data already, but say using some of these technologies to make it just verbal, right, conversational. Tell me about the biggest risk to drought in my area, or inquiries like that. And so when we have that data, when we have that global picture, we can develop planting intention data for local farmers. And it isn't, we don't generally reach the smallholder farmer, but this kind of information platform has the ability to support that data distribution.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. I'm going to turn it over to Dhesigen for the final words on this panel.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have a few more words on the smallholders, but I guess we can take it in the break. So let me answer the direct question. Firstly, between the EU and Africa, and in and very specific parts of Africa, there's an ongoing trade tug-of-war, and that's been going on for decades. And our citrus farmers and wine producers and ostrich meat producers have serious scars over the years. So there are new dimensions of this challenge that are coming up, particularly on the back of CBAMs, but we're alive to it. And there are smart ways to solve that for mutual benefit. It's about whether or not that rationale will be accepted and there'll be a willingness for that engagement. And I know we're talking about peace and security in a completely different realm, but that's another arena where there might be some really useful interventions on peace and security to help with the negotiators. On the energy transition and agriculture, it's quite amazing, but that JETP deal is completely silent about agriculture. You know, it's focused on electricity, transport, green hydrogen as the big blocks, and some words that encompass the rest. So what we're doing now is engineering a new instrument that will be comprehensive. We're calling it the Just Adaptation and Resilience Partnership concept. And this is where several of the sectors that are already intimately affected will then have a chance to start growing that decarbonization footprint towards higher resilience going into the future. But the primary thing around all of this is the justice element has to be key. There is no argument about the need for the transition. There's a lot of anxiety that it can leave us with a more unequal world than we currently have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. It's 12 o'clock and 39 seconds. Absolutely splendid. You are up for a German-style early lunch, but then again, it's free, so I hope you will enjoy. Thank you for making this an interesting panel, and please join me in thanking our speakers today.